Hello and good evening. Today I'm speaking to, hope I get his surname right. It's Stephan Sander-Faes,
Yeah,
who is
close
in
enough.
close enough. Yeah, based in Norway, originally from Austria, and he wrote a very interesting article on, I would say, the abuse of far right symbolism, neo-Nazi symbolism in the Austrian press. It's not just unique to Austria, but the article covers a little bit about that. And then we're going to go into the comparisons that were drawn between the COVID Nazis and the Ukrainian Nazis, if I got it that. So yeah, welcome.
Thanks a lot, and it's a great pleasure to be on your show, in particular, as it's rare that academic articles gather that much interest. So I'm very grateful to be here.
I actually want to speak to that point. I think if academics write to the public as an audience, there is a people who are interested. There's a lot of people who don't have the time to scrutinize everything, but they know that there's a lot more to the world going on than what is just in the news, if I can say it that way. So articles like that, it helps frame things a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. But then again, over the past couple of decades, academia has been transformed in a way. So
Mm.
everybody now needs to do what's called outreach or public, and then add your discipline, history in my case. And we always wonder what that is. So as a reviewer, say for multilateral European institutions as well as national science foundations, I always come to that point in the grant proposals that I'm asked to review. It's like, okay, what are you going to do? So, oh, you're going to write a blog. And sometimes I actually click on blogs from
Mm.
older projects that have been funded. And it's like 3 posts in the first month. Then there is a hiatus for until the next one. And then it kind of peters out. The same with
Yeah.
Twitter, the Twitter feed. So it's outreach and public. Put your discipline next to the adjective. It's one thing, but to actually approach the a wider audience, I think, is extremely important. I mean, Chomsky
Mm.
wrote about it in the responsibility of intellectuals like
That's
50
right.
or so years ago. But if you look at the current crop, it's, I think, not that academics don't want to speak to audiences, but there is, in particular, I mean, you mentioned the COVID situation as well as Ukraine and the propaganda angle, but we must always remember when talking about propaganda, as opposed to say, and this is not a simple either or thing, but basically propaganda is the opposite of rhetoric.
Mm.
Rhetoric, in the classical sense of the term, means the power of persuasion of an argument. So we may engage in rhetoric if we have a conversation about pick any topic, and I try to convince you of my point of view, you do the same, vice versa, and at some point we may get to to an arrangement, as in either one's arguments overcomes the others,
Yeah.
or we come to the conclusion to agree to disagree. But either way, it's fine. This is how discussion, debate, and rhetoric works. Propaganda isn't. Propaganda does not want to do persuasion. Propaganda just wants to blanket you with one side of the argument without
Is that a
allowing.
particular type of propaganda? Because I mean,
I
the way I look at it is you have persuasive propaganda as well. You could call it advertising. I mean, some people would go that far. And then you have this darker form of propaganda that Marcus Miller talked about, the persuasive one. It sort of it shows you an ugly image, and then it makes you not look at the argument. I
Yeah,
guess that is sort of part of what we're going with the article you wrote about.
yeah. I think we gotta disentangle this a little bit in terms of uh, I would say, yes, there is black and white propaganda, the one that Mark talks about. There is, of course, also the additional, let's say, this is kind of like how it works and how it is displayed. Could be text, could be images, could be a sound bite, for instance, or a combination of these. And then I would still think that the main issue is propaganda, to bring it back to the last thing that you have said. I think is, as opposed to rhetoric, as we just mentioned, propaganda actually does not want to have an argument. Yes, it does want to convince you, but only with one side, a predetermined outcome. And this is very different from rhetoric. Say, if we are having a conversation about, I don't know, do you like your French fries with mustard or with ketchup, for instance? And you are a ketchup guy and I'm on team mustard, for instance.
Right.
We could end up, coming up with something like, say, okay, I'm going to try it. Maybe we want to mix mustard and ketchup. I don't know. But it's not predetermined. But if I'm going to do propaganda on this issue, I'm going to tell you that mustard is better because I just said so. You don't need to even try alternatives because ketchup, contains much more sugar. So I can make up arguments that are factually correct. And this is one of the issues I think that's really, really important. So propaganda does not want to have a debate.
Right.
So propaganda, I think, is one side of the coin, and the flip side, of course, is censorship. Because you don't want to have the argument, but there is I could pull up a poll of people who say, to stick with my example of French fries with ketchup or mustard, who 8 out of 10 people prefer ketchup to mustard. But there's also a tiny fringe minority that also likes mayonnaise on top of it. So what do we do with those? So you don't want to have this kind of argument if you're going to do propaganda. You just want to, in a way, use any kind of image, text, spectacle, noise, sound, whatever you want to think of. And you want to just use that as a battering ram to kind of stampede the opposition. You don't want to have a debate, is what I'm saying, if you're going to do propaganda.
I've got, before we dig into the details of your article, I've got a question on that. Are the people who participate in propaganda, who spread it, are they, in a sense, useful idiots? I.e., they are convinced, they are high on their own fumes, they're convinced of their own propaganda, or are they deliberately lying? And it's always been difficult for me to distinguish which one you're dealing with.
Oh, that's a tricky one. So first of all, because of the phrase "useful idiots," it's Soviet communist terminology of fellow travelers in the
Right.
West who, in a way, just to provide the historical context for this. So I can't really answer your question about are they useful idiots or are they willfully ignorant or just ignorant as in they may not know better. I don't know that because I'm asking myself the same question in terms of are they that stupid or is this kind of premeditated? But it's I can't infer intent because
Right.
I cannot get into other people's heads. That said, however, I would say, and I think what Mark Crispin Miller talks about when he's there's the black and the white propaganda. That is the propaganda, the white one is the good one, the one that we kind of approve of because it aligns with our values, our sympathies, and anything else, which is easy enough to kind of I would say agree with and act upon, such as say you see images of refugees, especially elderly, frail, sick women and children from pick any war theater right now. And then this is usually used to solicit donations to help those people. And this is, I would argue, one of the prime examples of white or good propaganda. We all know this is kind of we don't know what it's been there. Hopefully nobody has ever in a way to go through this, but unfortunately there's a lot of war and conflict, strife going on, and we all can relate to this, as in Jesus Christ, if this was my kid or my grandmother who's there. So it's easy, it's triggering our buttons.
But that's a bit of a weaponization of empathy as well.
It is, but this is where I was going to go with this, because you said some say advertisement is propaganda, and it is. You go back to Edward Bernays, who worked for the Creel Commission in the United States in the First World War. The book with the same title came out in, I think it was 1928. You can clearly see how they are weaponizing what they have learned from mass psychology and the insights garnered from let's say advances or new discoveries and developments in pre-World War I European psychology and psychoanalysis. In particular, because Bernays was related a couple of corners, I think, with Sigmund Freud
Yeah.
So there is that as well. So it's a weaponization, and that alone, that term, and I'm going to go to the empathy, get back to the empathy part of your question in a moment. But it's important to remember propaganda, for good or ill, is a weapon of war. And propaganda is nothing new. The term itself comes out of the Vatican, the Catholic Church, and the Counter Reformation, which is much closer to my own areas of expertise
Right.
than you would probably have imagined 15 minutes or so ago.
Well,
But
the best way I always describe it is somebody told me it was the Indian constitution, but I haven't found the actual phrase. It is that you have the right to preach and propagate, to spread the
yes,
message. So that
to spread the
propagate
gospel.
message, it's very important.
Yes, but the way how this works, if you go back to Counter Reformation, say late 16th century, early 17th century Europe, is basically fire and sword. So you don't want to have an argument. If you don't want the Protestants, in that case, preaching, you just expel them. There would be, of course, other ways and means how to kind of like convince, so to speak, in scare quotes, the local populace not to listen to the Lutherans or the Calvinists preaching the gospel, as in like torture or forcing. And this is very important, because this entire notion of propaganda, if you look at the history of the preaching of the gospel in the Catholic Church way in the Counter Reformation, is very interesting, because parts of present day Austria, that is where they rolled this out. So the blueprint involved something like what's called Reformation commissions in a way. So it's basically a couple of Catholic clergy accompanied by a troop of soldiers. They go into villages where they know that there hasn't been like a Catholic priest and a parishioner for decades. All the people are Lutherans in that case, or Calvinists, and they just destroy everything that reeks of Lutheranism. They force baptize everyone present, and then they make sure that they just adhere, at least on a more or less superficial level, to the right faith. And this
Right.
is, if needs be, repeated. And it is not only repeated, but it's like the same in village after village after village after village. So
So
it's
it
not,
becomes a ritual. It's part. The ritual plays a part in sort of keeping the
yeah,
faith, entrenched.
exactly. But it also goes back to what you said. It's a weapon in the most literal sense of the term, historically speaking. Now, over the ensuing decades, with there being no Protestantism allowed in those areas, you would then, of course, get to the point where people, in a way, forget all the cruelty and all the hardship that was associated with this, let's say, forced conversion, because that's simply the only game in town. But then again, even if you would say, okay, good, well, Catholic creed or one of the Protestant ones, in the long run, I mean, people seem to be okay-ish with it. And so why would I care about something that happened 400-500 years ago? Because you can see the same mechanism of propaganda, which means A, it's a weapon of war. B, that would be, or it's a kind of like weapon of domination and control. And B, it doesn't want to convince, because if you would imagine like around 1600 somewhere Central Europe, you put like in front of a crowd a Catholic, a Lutheran, and a Calvinist, and throw in a Muslim as well as an Orthodox Christian, and say like, and an Anglican and whatever else. You guys have a discussion, and then we'll have a vote on it. You can imagine that there will be a lot of disagreement.
Yeah.
But propaganda doesn't want to have an argument in the first place. There is but one thing that propaganda wants, and that is to persuade you. 300, 400, 500 years ago, that's the fire and the sword. These days, it's more like advertisement. This brings us again to the empathy part that you mentioned, which I think is crucial here, because a lot of these things, they trigger us, and they trigger a lot of us in many, many different ways. We're all individuals. I mean, it's like you and I, even though we may hold, I'm presuming this, So we may hold certain things dear to our, let's say, moral values or our intellectual curiosity, whatever. Pick anything, or even football teams. Doesn't matter. But we may have disagreements. But propaganda doesn't want to have that. And
Right.
propaganda does not want to, offer you a choice. So you get to be triggered, and it's again predetermined, and it's a weapon. And all of this brings us together. It can be for a good thing, arguably, like soliciting donations for destitute refugees would certainly, to my mind, qualify as that.
Right.
Or it could be in a way like inciting hatred and violence, as we can see in the context of the blanket propaganda efforts that we see when it comes to the Russian operation in Ukraine. Now
And,
that
and and
doesn't.
that operation is very interesting because here we have a clear example of both sides engaging in propaganda. Now that is not to, and here's the tricky part about the propaganda. As soon as you make that statement, they're saying you're justifying the war, which is not, it's not even what I'm saying. But automatically, you need to explain the nuance before you can even engage in the argument, and that to me is the first sign that we're dealing with propaganda here.
Yeah,
If we are talking about NATO expansionism, for example, that is a talking point of Russian propaganda. That's a fact. It doesn't mean it's false. It just means it's being
exactly.
exploited. So this is part of the nuance that I think we run into here.
Yeah, and it's not just the nuances that are important. Just imagine the terminology that we're using. You just mentioned the war, which is the word that I didn't use, and the
Yeah.
reason why I did is I'm sorry to say that, but I do a lot of legal history, and I've spent the last 10 plus years reading legal documents, mainly from hundreds of years ago. So I would argue a war is, you can use the term, of course, but if we're using it in the present context, is it one? And I'm not saying this to make, some kind of like ivory tower-esque academic argument, but under international law, to be called a war requires a declaration of such a state of affairs, which hasn't happened, neither by Ukraine nor by Russia, which means it's really tricky. Do you remember, by the way, the Iraq intervention, or the
Yeah, the US intervention in Iraq, well,
the
its invasion in Iraq.
US-led invasion? And I remember this, it was the early days of Wikipedia. There was a question whether or not we're going to capitalize the W in war, because a capitalized war is a declared one, i.e. a legal one. And then we get into like the question, is something that may or may not be sanctioned or permitted by UN Security Council resolutions. However, falsely and misleading, the United States government has acted in 2002, 2003 to kind of like try to justify their
Right.
invasion. But is a US-led coalition of the willing a subject of international law when it comes to specifically those legal terms? And then we run into a lot of nuance, I would argue, where we could spend a lot of time talking about it, while in, was it Richard Pearl or Paul Wolfowitz? One of them, one of these two, I think it was Pearl, but I'm not sure about the name, who said, like, look, you can debate, I'm paraphrasing this slightly, you can debate this and all the facts, but while you debate this, we are going to act, because this is what we do. We create our own reality, he says.
It was Dick Cheney, I think, his
Was it?
reality. Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
could
So
be.
he said that we are the history's makers, and you
Yeah.
study us, and basically we get to set the reality. And that is, of course, you're referring to America being the superpower at the time. International law can be seen as extraterritorialization of U.S. law in some cases. In
In
some
many
cases, it's
ways,
true.
that is a fair characterization. And I wouldn't even argue or subscribe to the argument that it's a bad thing just because it comes from the US. I would just point out that there is usually, as you just said a couple of moments ago, there is the Russian side of things and there is the Western side of things. Both use propaganda to convey this. And kind of like, you need to be able to see both sides, and as many other sides as well, to be able to come to something like the approximation of making an informed, choice about this or that topic that we're talking about. I'll just give you another example, which probably is going to annoy a lot of potential Anglo-American viewers and listeners. But you and I, we both have followed, I'm presuming this here, that the Supreme Court has determined by a sizable margin that the Roe v. Wade decision should go back to state legislatures.
Yeah.
So you see that a lot of like the, let's say, progressive self-styled liberal press and a lot of those activists are now claiming this is like the worst decision since baby Hitler was born or something like that. I'm of course a little bit, joking about this
No,
part,
but there is a big moral outrage against it in America.
Exactly.
Protests and everything. Yeah.
Exactly. But look at the decision. I mean, if you look at the text that has been leaked and the decision that has been handed down, it's like, look, this is nothing. I'm paraphrasing here, that basically 9 unelected judges should get to decide and impose by judicial fiat onto the residents of 50 plus states or something like this. So please, dear state legislatures, do your homework on this one. And to kind of like come up with it, which I think is a perfectly reasonable explanation as to why, and an invitation to democratic participation in the legislative process. I don't know how anyone could be opposed to that if I'm going to put this out there I hope it's not going to generate some outrage, but if you want to have a public debate about the pros and cons, the merits and the consequences of, in this case, the right to legal abortion in this or that state. If you don't want to have it, you're going to scream bloody murder.
Yeah, we see that is part of the issue we're getting into here again with the propaganda as well. As you say, it doesn't want the argument. So in that case, in particular, you could say there's pro-abortion, anti-abortion propaganda that regards it as an absolute right, meaning as soon as you speak in absolutes, there is no democratic debate. As soon as you say
there's
it's
only yes or no. There's
Yeah.
only yes or no. And as you just said, you said there's no compromise, but there's also no compromise possible because there is no debate. So we can't just have a compromise such as, I mean, if you get into the details, I mean, it's like, I think it was 12 weeks, first trimester where it is legal. And then there is a question under certain conditions, maybe it may be longer. It varies a little bit from country to country to country, that period where it is legal. But to have an abortion, but I don't want to even talk about the topic. I just want to talk about the weaponization of it, because you can't even have a debate about this if we reduce it to absolutes. And if it's only yes or no, you can't have, nuance. There is no debate because the reduction to having a yes or no, up or down idea is basic or kind of like question precludes the possibility of having a conversation in the first place. And this ties, I think, all back to like the weaponization of empathy, because what we are doing is we are weaponizing with this kind of propaganda. What is done is it's triggering people, to use a very, let's say, a very up-to-date terminology on this one. It is pushing our buttons, and there is not much we can do, especially if the text or the audio voiceover is accompanied by, graphic images or what have you.
No, it's morally loaded arguments is usually used as well. So it's all of these, say deliberately tries to trigger you. So I want to pivot now to the article you wrote about. It's titled "Far Right Extremism and Neo-Nazis Everywhere, but Some Are More Worthy Than Others." So that's quite a catchy title in a way. You say some Nazis are more worthy than others. How do you explain that?
Well, I think it's a very bulky one, and I do like early modern European history, where usually book titles have cover the entire front page. So there is that part, which I think can be said half in jest. I'll start at the end of the title, the worthy aspect, of course, goes back to Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky's The Manufacturing Consent volume, where they talk about worthy and unworthy victims.
Right.
So this is a kind of like reference as well as a kind of like word play in a way, in a very bad one, which actually the editors have suggested that that might be a very useful and very helpful framing. So that is one thing. The other thing is I've been following the let's say media coverage in Austria because I have, of course, family there and I like to visit and everything else. After all, I'm a citizen of that country. So I think it is also my civic duty and responsibility to stay on top of events.
Right.
But there was this, in a way, like this moment when in November, which was like the tail end of the Delta wave, talking about SARS-CoV-2 variants here. And just before Omicron got really started, uh, the federal government in Austria has, in a way, declared that it's the unvaccinated that are driving all of this infectious pressure and the transmission and the disease, and hospitals are overloaded.
Pandemic of the unvaccinated. I remember that phrase.
Exactly. That was part of this as well. So, and their quote unquote solution, given that injection uptake was hovering, I would have to go back to, so don't quote me on that number. It wasn't high enough for the government. And from what we knew back then, the knowledge that was publicly available, without diving into like the references and the comments and footnotes of preprints and comparing the preprint studies that were put out with the peer-reviewed version later, you could make a reasonable argument that it might be an interesting trade-off or a useful trade-off as a society to, restrict access to certain parts of the public to large segments of the population. And remember, back then in Austria, roughly a third of those deemed, so to speak, eligible, like 18 plus, of the population had remained unvaccinated. So they were basically telling a third of the country to kind of like go into house arrest.
Right.
And the really strange thing about this is this, in a way, caused a lot of like anger and resentment and a kind of like political consciousness that drove tens of thousands of citizens into the streets every week in like the depth of winter, which weather-wise is pretty bad. It's cold, just above freezing temperature. Usually it's like rainy, it's windy, but there they are, tens of thousands of people protesting.
I could not remember a period that had such a long, extension of consecutive protests weekend after weekend. Yeah, in France as well. I mean, it was crazy, the amount of protests that was going on, and how the media downplayed the protests. And even despite the downplaying by the media, the protests grew.
Yeah. I mean, the yellow vests, the Gilets jaunes in France, this is like a perfect example of pre-COVID, one-sidedness in the media combined with the censorship. So you can see it's like flip sides, two sides of the same coin, really. And this has to do with how propaganda functions. You don't want the argument, hence you can't have it. Because even if you would concede that in the French case, the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, had a point, that would be tantamount to admission of failure. And the same dynamic played out in Austria, where, of course, they went into full lockdown. They then let those vaccinated out. So they introduced the EU digital COVID certificate, which I personally think is an abomination because it restricts access to certain people who back then, and this is one part where I don't think it's just morally justified to call it an abomination, but it's also in terms of like civic rights violations, because how can you have like voluntary vaccination combined with a document that restricts access to public areas based on something that is technically voluntary? So basically, it's like more or less arbitrary. So this is
The
one thing.
voluntary is taken out of it. I mean, it's just enforced through other means,
Exactly. And this brings us to the enforcement part of this. And this is something that I actually study in the 19th century currently. How does state power grow into areas, I would even say metastasize into areas previously beyond its control? And this is technically done via, on the one hand, reducing options, which in a way, as we just spoke about these digital COVID certificates, by taking away certain aspects of public life in that case, and making it in a way like easy or seemingly easy to kind of like segue into okay, coming to this decision that okay, maybe I should just do this so I can do that. So this is one thing, and the other thing is you enforce it by using what in academic terms would be called non-state actors. And so I researched this, basically looking at how traditional patrimonial social relations, what used to be called feudalism until the Soviet Union disappeared and we thought we never have to think about materialism
Right.
or anything ever again. And feudalism means there is something we call domination. So basically, you have the landowner on whose land live the subjects. And the thing is, whatever the monarch does, he or she is connected to the landowner. And the landowners constitute both a social status group, it's the aristocracy or the clergy. In the French context, until the French Revolution did away with all those privileges in the 1790s. East of the Rhine, this took until the second half of the 19th century. But there is this weird combination of having this social status group that comes with privilege of birth, in addition to being a class in the Marxian terms, in terms of like they own the land, which in pre-industrial circumstances is the primary, in a way, like the means of production.
I would argue still today the land ownership, so property ownership, let me call it that.
Exactly.
Still is the leap up. I mean, it's I think widely accepted that is the primary driver of inequality.
That I would subscribe to as well. And to go back to the non-state actor dynamic, the landowner, in our example, the property owner, he or she owns a piece of land, a hotel, a restaurant, a supermarket, whatever. But now the government, the state, is asking him to check both the digital COVID vaccination certificate, which is legally as well as technically speaking, these are medical records which are enshrined or come with a lot of like privacy rights and guarantees. And this is but a medical document, so the restaurant owner, the shop assistant if you buy clothes or shoes, or somebody in the grocery store, or even the clerk at the hotel bar, he or she would then have to see if the medical record says, in my case, I'm Stephan, and am I really me? I could be holding anyone else's, medical record. Yeah. So they need to see photo ID. So what we're seeing here is the same dynamic we can observe 200 years ago in the things that I study, where the government is mandating that somebody who is not law enforcement checks your papers, and not only your ID paper, but also your medical records. And this is a very, very slippery slope, because they are told you need to do this to keep us all safe. So you see that there is again the triggering and the pushing of buttons with this kind of propaganda. And nobody stops for a minute, it seems. And things like, how do we get back to kind of like how things were before, where we had a lot of laws and put a lot of effort to precisely safeguard against access to medical records by those who are not authorized and entitled to see it? I mean, in all Western countries, we have confidentiality enshrined in the law when it comes to precisely the relation between a patient and his or her doctor, and a client and his or her lawyer.
Yeah. But what was interesting to me is how this issue transpired in South Africa because it's within living memory. Okay. And on my living memory, I mean, people actually experienced it, not even their parents, where the apartheid state had what was called a Donpas system. Okay. And the South African government till today has not enforced these permits, for example, because they know what's coming their way. They know what's going to happen if you bring back those things. And the apartheid state, to your point, did the exact same thing. It went to business owners to enforce the laws. It required of homeowners to clean the streets at night, for example, when there was a night clock law, all kinds of small things like that. And ironically, how the system collapsed was because of the economics.
Yeah,
The laws went to the absurdity of it. So when my father was working on construction sites in the 70s and 80s, for example, there were laws that the white population could only do certain jobs and the black population could do other things. But it was economically inefficient. So what happened is everyone did the job, or they organized labor as they thought, and not as the government proposed. And when the time came, they just paid the bribes. And it was the
yeah,
bribery that brought down the system. And I saw something similar coming in France. I don't think the system ran to that point yet. But as soon as the government imposed these laws in France, automatically in the street close to where I stay, people proposing me 550 to 100 euros for a passport, a digital passport. Okay, so a lot of people got rich out of it. When I saw that thing coming, I said, I don't think the government knows what demon they've unleashed in this whole process, because
yeah,
automatically you're creating the incentive structure for corruption to take over
yeah,
the
yeah.
system.
And it's creating an entire new, let's say, subset of this. It's not that as if forgeries of passports and records and stuff. I mean, when I stayed in the United States as a visiting professor at Columbia University, I was given a social security number on a scrap of paper. And the clerks at the Social Security office told me, this is the most forged document in America. And it's like, really? On a scrap of paper?
Yeah,
And it's like, so the incentive structure is always there, but it's always this kind of like it's the competition between the illegal part of the economy, the black economy, so to speak, and the legal one, where things go kind of like orderly, or are supposedly going in a well organized fashion that is more or less conforming to the laws that are on the books. But what we are doing now is we're creating a kind of like, let's say, uh, societal delusion in a way, uh, that we need to do this or that. I mean, it doesn't matter if you want to agree with, the COVID policies, or with, the war between, or the conflict. See, now I'm using the word war as well, between Ukraine and Russia. Would NATO be a participant? It's hard to say what's the status of NATO under international law, but even so, we are creating these kinds of like illusions also, and delusions, that this is how it's supposed to work. Whereas before the state of emergency has been declared all over the world in a way, and it's been particularly absurd the longer it continues in many European countries. Uh, we are creating this kind of like, subset. It's almost like a mirage, or some kind
no,
of like fictional real or alternative reality, where, if for instance, I live in Norway, so basically the government has done away with all the mandates and everything else in March and February of this year, because the public health authorities said the longer we keep them up, the longer this will take. So they followed through with this. Every time I talk to my relatives and friends in Austria, they go like, "What? You don't have mandates?" It's like, how does this work with you guys? It's like, I mean, it's not all roses here, by far not. And the gaslighting in the media, mostly by omission or the refusal to cover certain topics, is of course hilariously absurd. And this goes to both the COVID part as well as the
yeah,
Russian-Ukrainian conflict. But still, it's like, how do you get out of all of this? So the first rule I would argue is like, if you're in a hole, stop digging. But that,
but
you
that's
know,
impossible in politics. It's
I'm not sure. The question is, if I think we'd need to add to that proverb if you want to get out of it. And that's a big hypothetical.
Well, the problem is, I mean, this was the case of Emmanuel Macron, is he just kept on doubling down, and he kept on appointing advisors who were more, one was more scared than the other. There was one stage where his original advisor said, "Look, this is crazy," and then he just gets a guy that's crazier than him. So the whole cycle is there. Then of course elections came into play. So I mean, this year, for example, mandates only came down a week before the election. Now that's a big surprise, you know.
Did they
Um,
come back a week thereafter, I guess?
they sort of still, yeah, they starting with the war propaganda, the COVID propaganda again in the trains, because and it's somewhat working, somewhat not. So they now, for this whole summer so far, they haven't, nobody's been wearing masks. A few people, some still do it out of voluntary stuff. I'm not opposed to that. But now again, they're making noise. They've got these announcements, right? And they say the mask at this stage is recommended. It's recommended.
Yeah.
Um, but it is, it's for your own protection. It's only recommended. And now you see a few more people wear it. Now I bet you in 2 weeks' time it's strongly recommended, then it's stronger, and then it's mandatory, and then they'll start enforcing it again when this winter comes, because that's, I guess, they're ramping up for the winter. That's my
Yeah.
suspicion.
Yeah, that is what I would think is behind all of it in this regard. I mean, if you think about it in terms of like, I mean, we never really had that many mandates here in Norway because people
Mm.
simply follow, advice and recommendations well enough, so the government doesn't have to enforce it. And you said something that I found interesting just a couple of moments ago, where you said like one of the advisors, the more advisors were brought in, and you know the newer guy was always more insane or more agitated than the previous guy. And I think it has to do with like the dynamics of politics. If you want to be heard, you gotta yell fire in a crowded theater the loudest.
Right.
And if that does not work, you yell fire. Also, there is a dude with an assault rifle next to this guy who yells fire. And then, how do you climb down from this kind of like, escalation ladder?
Well,
Which I,
the way they climbed down was the Omicron variant. That was part of it. I think some people use that as an off ramp, saying, "Okay, it's mutated to be less dangerous," and then they sort of walked out of it. And I want to get your opinion here on the Ukraine story. I mean, I spoke to Noam Chomsky, and I've been corresponding with him since the war started, and he's, by and large, been saying what most people have been saying: peace can only come if America negotiates with Putin. We have to accept, we have to share this continent with Russia, whether we like them or not. Now, it doesn't mean, again, we don't justify anything Putin is doing, but to get people to negotiate, they need an off ramp, and
yeah,
I don't see that off ramp being presented at the moment. There's some positive signs with the grain deal that came through. Okay, we got grain out.
yeah.
People shouldn't starve of food. Maybe that's part of the negotiations.
Well, since it's my opinion, I'm gonna be as let's say, I'll try to be as concise as possible.
Sure.
um, One of my friends, who is actually a Russian studies scholar, very senior professor, said like, look, I've been studying Russia for like my entire career. You just don't understand that, what the Russian government is saying, it's all lies and everything else. And I don't dispute that. All governments lie. This is what they do. This is like
Right.
the premise. And to simply come out and say, look, I don't like this government in particular because of pick any reasons. So I will now declare everything this guy says to be a lie, while I start ludicrously believing everything my government tells me is a preposterously
Exactly.
insane proposition. It brings back memories of this kind of like, this old Cold War era joke, which I'm, of course, not old enough to remember, so I read it someplace, of an American and a Soviet citizen meeting each other. And the Americans is like, hey, do you? I mean, I don't know much about the Soviet Union. Do you have news media like we do in the US and the Free West? So, yeah, sure. We have, Pravda, and we have TASS and everything else. And the American goes like, do you read our media, like the New York Times, the Washington Post? And like, uh, well, the Russian says, yeah, sure. I'm reading about them if I want to learn about, my country. And the American is like, do you also read them if you want to learn about the United States? And the Russian goes like, no, I'm going to read like Pravda because your media is lying as much about your
Well,
country as
you say my wife is from Iran. Okay, so I was in Iran last year and I was watching Iranian TV with her mother. So we're sitting there and I follow a few words in Farsi, but I don't understand it, and she's helping me. I was so informed on the United States. I discovered in that period that there was an earthquake in Florida, a bridge collapsed, totally unreported in US media, and that part of the invasion of Afghanistan was because who was this guy? His name was Prince, one of these Blackwater guys. He had a deal with a company selling talc with Johnson and Johnson, baby milk powder, and there was some talc mine in Afghanistan. I'm like, wow, that's quite informed on US foreign policy. I learned a thing or two, you know. So yeah, that was
yeah.
sort of the what you just said. And then you ask Iranians, what do you know about your own government? They go like this. We don't know much, but we're
And,
quite.
and and they don't want to talk about it because it's dangerous. In some places, it's really physically dangerous to talk about these topics in an open conversation.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, so just getting to your article again, you draw the parallels between, as you say, Nazism being presented, anti-vaxxers, and Ukrainian Nazis. So, what do you think is the truth of both of them? I mean, I suppose anti-vaxxers being Nazis is absurd. I
No,
couldn't
you
buy
see,
anything there.
no, I mean, I didn't say anti-vaxxers are Nazis. I'm just saying in the article, I'm looking at two
Yeah,
very specific news media items that are hilariously absurd because they appeared within like 2 weeks of each other. So basically, the first one covered, it was like a picture symbolism. It was branded as like analysis in a very left, liberal, progressive newspaper, and it had a lot of pictures. I don't know if anyone really clicked on a German article and looked at the images, which I was not allowed to reproduce for intellectual property reasons in my piece. But I would really encourage anyone to look at those pictures because they are what people look at first, and then maybe they read the text and caption. And this is a problem because the image in our highly visualized culture conveys so much before people start to read and try to add nuance, both getting the nuance and the information from the caption in that case, as well as what they know themselves and what they think they know, and what they do their own research on. And the really odd thing was the argument. The argument is there's like tens of thousands of protesters, as we talked about a couple of moments ago. They are protesting against the injection mandate. And all that you see is like picture after picture after picture after picture of there may be Nazis among like 40 or 50,000 protesters, like a handful. And the text is almost making the case that the presence of a handful of Nazis or suspected Nazis or right-wing extremists would render the entire protest illegitimate. It's almost akin to saying you need to kind of like make sure to check everybody's placards and make sure everybody in advance before you congregate is on the same page as you, ideologically speaking,
right.
to kind of like make sure that there are no neo-Nazis kind of like taking over your protest, which is tantamount to saying we need a
And
safe space for mass protests, which is I can't even say it's an absurdity because it's like an absurdity
any
times.
protest has an absurdity. I mean, I remember the COP21 protest when they was in Paris. I mean, there was a lot of green guys, but a lot of them, and I'm quite neutral environmental stuff. I think they sometimes go a bit too far, but there were a lot of crazy green people. I thought these people want to really kill the children to stop depopulation, and they were there. Nobody mentioned that because they made out the fraction of the population. But you're always going to have a broad church of that includes, unfortunately, a few nutcases.
Exactly. But the argument was basically this entire protest is borderline illegitimate for the simple reason of the presence of a couple of nutcases, as you just put it so politely. But within 2 weeks, the Austrian state media company published a very long expose detailing that Mr. Putin's claims, one of his stated aims of what the Russians call a special military operation, was to denazify Ukraine. And it's not as if Western media, including, as I have linked to in the article, including the United States military, hasn't said there are Nazis there. It's not as if this wasn't known.
Right.
But the argument basically was that was conveyed by Austrian state media was, yeah, there may be some, but it's like they're kind of like there's only a few of them, and they are fighting for kind of like the right cause, which is against the Russians. So we could probably, be okay with it.
Okay, fair enough.
And I mean, if you put this is why I wrote the article, because this was so patently absurd, where you would think like, and by the way, these are not the only two examples I could cite and throw at you in this regard. So, for instance, just 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was an article by a freelancer who wrote about, like on tour with the Azov troops outside Kharkov or Kharkiv, and I'm not making any of this up, actually had like pictures with them where they spoke about, showed some of the tattoos, like, swastikas and all these other, symbols. And then it was portrayed as, if I recall correctly, uh, neo-Nazi or right-wing extremist aesthetics. There was,
okay.
yeah, it's like, and it was accompanied by statements from those 22-year-old Azov fighters. Like, yeah, kind of like they go, we kind of like this because it's part of our heritage, Slavic, Germanic, Nordic. So, we just like them. The swastika is way older.
So
And it's
I'm
like,
wondering what will happen if somebody goes to the Austrian or the German parliament and say this is part of our heritage.
oh God, don't go even there. I wouldn't even start thinking about it. But you raise a valid point. And this is like, if it's okay to sympathize and weaponize empathy with the Ukrainian people, I mean that's one thing. But if you use the same arguments and the same methods to discredit and declare borderline illegitimate any potential protest against you know government policy, that is a very, very slippery slope. I mean, you go back to classical Greece, where you can basically see, in a way, like Thucydides writes about this in the Peloponnesian War, makes the argument. I hope I'm paraphrasing this somewhat correctly, like the strong do what they do and the poor suffer what they must. I mean, you can make the case kind of like it has always been so, because this is the human condition, this is the nature of power, etc. But in this way, it's very insidious, because the tyranny that Athens visited upon the weaker ones, when that finally got home to Athens, they had a dictatorship back home. And what
Right.
I'm not going to say that the state of emergency declared by democratically elected governments, however imperfect our Western kind of democracy is in practice. I'm not saying this is the same as, fascist dictatorship, but there is, a slippery slope, and the demonization of one group, for instance, like those unvaccinated, those anti-vaxxers, and using the same methodology and same argument, like there may be Nazis among them, hence all of them are, even though we are not really sure, is like, making a blanket both value judgment as well as, slanderous accusation of guilt by association, even if
Yeah.
it's, people who protest for the simple reason such as bodily autonomy. And I mean, this list is endless, and the media coverage is so deplorable in this regard.
But how does one, I mean, bring this demon under control? Because I mean, it's been going on for a long time. I mean, okay, this is now two cases that are in contemporary memory, but Iraq War had something similar. If you criticize WMDs in the beginning of the war, they were automatically saying to be using Saddam talking points. That
Yeah,
was sort of a favorite catchword. Similar, tricks that's being used. you can cite other examples in Zimbabwe, for example, which is rather tragic. When independence came, there were a minority among the black population who said, let's make a government of national unity, like Bishop Abel Musarewa. And automatically Mugabe said this guy is cooperating with Britain and the West, So, and consequently, the population fell for the propaganda and they suffered. They're still suffering until today. So, the how do you? I suppose it comes back to the media. You need a media that is at least got some editorial standard to objectivity, or that isn't held captive by interests. I don't know how to even solve this problem, because the techniques are as old as humankind, but yet we are constantly seeing them being reused. And the scary thing is they now spring to social media and they sort of fine tuned,
Yeah.
for the particular case.
I mean, I recall one of Joe Rogan's interviews with Edward Snowden. Uh, it's all on Spotify. He did two, I think it was in the latter, when Snowden mentioned that the censorship by private companies such as YouTube kind of like really got going in the combination of the Islamic State and the cruelties that they committed, and the torture and the burning of people alive, and putting it all on YouTube. As I said, it's a slippery slope, and I happen to agree with Snowden on this one. Where do we stop now that there is a precedent? How do you do this? Is it that all people in media are kind of like bad and everything else? I mean, everybody can go to YouTube and look at and type in Noam Chomsky, Andy Marr, for instance, where Andy Marr goes in the context of the Iraq War, by the way, visits MIT and asks Chomsky the same question that you just alluded to in a way. It's like, are there no standards? Is there somebody like the government censor who looks at people like that? It's like, no, it's like media people, they go to the same universities, they are in the same fraternities, they hang out after work together, they congregate in the same socially more or less closed environments, etc. And I think it was Greenwald in his conversation with Rogan who made the points like they are very sensitive to being kind of like ostracized from these circles because they switch from one high profile magazine.
It's groupthink, that's at the heart of this. Groupthink and tribal loyalty. I mean, they're loyal to the tribe.
Yeah, and they also know that if you write something that goes against what the senior editors kind of like want to see, then you will not be promoted. Then you will be passed over. Then you will not have a career there. I mean, I'm in academia, which is about as sycophantic as anything, and very comparable to, I would argue, media, to say nothing about politics here. But
and yet you have tenure. I don't know you particularly, but yet people have tenure, but they don't use the tenure to be provocative, to ask those legitimate questions.
I mean, that would be, the subject for another like hour-long conversation about, academia and everything else, which I'd really be happy to have. But the point you're raising is like, what do you do? There is a certain responsibility, I believe, as an educator, as an instructor, as an academic, which is why after 2 years of not doing this with my name attached, I finally wrote this piece. But it's and put my name next to it. And I would really like to see more people doing that. But I also know that, I mean, I'm tenured faculty, so lest there is a criminal conviction, I'm kind of like safe as I could be. But I know a couple of people who are not in this position, who would like to say something. But this is why I mentioned academia, I think, is very comparable to journalism, where they fear that they would never be able to pursue an academic career to the point where they get tenure, for the simple reason that speaking out right now would harm their economic interest. It has to do with, if you are, in the mid 30s to mid 40s, that's when most academics who decide to have children have them. It's an existential question in many ways. So there is so many, let's say, pressures that come from within the institution as well as from, let's say, society at large. You don't need, somebody to say like, you are not supposed to say this or that. You're not allowed to write this or that, because people will self-censor. And I don't know if this has always been so, but to speak a little bit more precisely to the point, that like what can be done about this. It's like creeps into social media, it creeps into our social circles, it's in our families, and I would simply point to the fact. I mean, there is this wonderful term by this Canadian scholar Marshall McLuhan, the Gutenberg galaxy, which has to do with the advent of print and how the printing press has changed literally everything, which in a way gave rise.
Message is the medium kind of guy. Yeah.
Exactly
Yeah.
the same guy. So I, as an early modernist, who, yes, I do read the printed one, but I'm more of a manuscript guy. Doesn't mean you should do one or the other, but combine them. I would argue doing both of them, manuscript and print, would be like you have the Gutenberg galaxy, but the manuscript world of, in my case, pre-industrial Europe would offer you, an entire parallel universe of experiences and of documents to work with, which if you just looked at the printed record, and to drive this home in a very ludicrous way, if you just read the articles that I analyzed in my propaganda in focus piece, you would get away with like, oh, there must be a bunch of Nazis among, the anti-vaxxers. This is totally unreasonable what they are doing, and they are, endangering everybody else. And you would also fall into the category, I would argue, of believing everything the Austrian state broadcaster,
Right.
spouts about Russia, about the conflict in Ukraine, etc. If you wouldn't have, other sources of information. But now with so few people, writing, I mean, I teach undergraduates. If you have to look at their handwriting, usually it's really bad because they don't, you know, do manuscript writing with their hands anymore. And if you look at this, we are losing that kind of like parallel universe. The more we,
Well, I
double
see
and
that in engineering as well. I
double and
was.
quadruple down on the advantages, the many that
Mhm.
the technological advances of computing, smartphones, tablets, etc. convey.
Well, I see, for example, that the problem. I mean, it's a question of medium, but it's like if I look at the older engineers, they used to do hand calculations, very simple calculations, but they used to solve an entire structure just doing a
Yeah,
few equations. And if you can combine that with your modern finite element analysis or computer software, I think you can be a much better engineer. And it's
you
the same, I
know,
think, for writers. It's a very similar thing that you need to work through most medium. But I think for people who are listening, the people who what they need to look at is they need to really question their media and get a variety of sources and mediums. I think there's something to the argument that if you're only going to be on Twitter, your attention span is going to be shorter, right? You have to
yeah.
force yourself to read, you have to watch videos, you have to get it from a variety of sources to try and make sense of the story, I think. And nobody can tell you how. That's the problem here. Everyone has to decide for himself.
Yeah, and I think one of the more insidious origins or causes of this is the decline of what's in let's say Anglo-American parlance would be liberal humanities, in terms of like, if you don't read like a 500 or 700 page novel because you like reading, your writing skills will be pretty crappy. Because if you only read like 140, 280 character long, Twitter bits and pieces, listen to 32-second sound bites, how do you make an argument? How can you convey at least a certain amount of nuance? One of the
Yeah.
criticisms that I got from friends and people writing me emails after reading my article was like, but never trust the Russians, because as my grandma has told me, you can't just do that because they are not trustworthy. I don't know. But what I would say, in terms of, I mean, I don't even know if this is a true statement or not, but let's leave that aside. But even if true, there is only so much you can gather in terms of like personal experiences that influence you. But if you look at this in terms of like, I mean, one of the aspects that I think isn't really very well covered is like, I mean, in my piece there's like tons of corruption in Russia in Ukraine. I'm not going to go into like, pharmaceutical companies and corruption and, the
Right.
repeat convictions of, say, Pfizer. I'm not going to get into all of this. Or, the Austrian state media recently ran something about, based on a New York Times article about Yandex, that Russian equivalent to Google, which used to be hip, but now they, work with the censors coming from the Kremlin, and now they are kind of like evil. And Google, they literally wrote, would be a perfect company, which is like, really, that would be an interesting proposition. And that only works if you omit the information, such as, you can say the monetary fees and penalties that, say, the European Union has slapped on Google for antitrust violations is kind of like pocket change for Alphabet. Yeah,
Yeah.
that may be so, but it is a fine issued by a regulator for transgression of laws. And to just say it's like a perfect company, I mean, this is like a ludicrous proposition, which only works, by the way, if you just present one side of the argument. And this brings us back to like the propaganda here. It's a weapon, and you just weaponize anything, really anything you can find, to just drive home this notion that there is this kind of like, almost, Mordor-like, entity, which is Russia, and everything they do is bad, and everything the
And
other
but
side.
there's so much cognitive dissonance there because on the one hand, they tell you that Russia is this evil empire that is waiting to invade Europe. Tomorrow they're going to be at the Straits of Gibraltar, whole story. On the other hand, they tell you that Russia is the economy the size of Spain or Italy, and it can barely fight a frontline battle in Ukraine. So which one is it? Those two are obviously not compatible, but I hear two people making the exact same arguments. Either they're a weak state, which I buy, actually. I don't think Russia is that much of a threat. It's a threat to Ukraine, obviously. It might be a threat to the Baltics even. I'm not so sure if it's a threat to Spain. I'm not so sure if it's a threat to Middle Europe. And if immediately if you accept that logic, you can say, but okay, there's different ways to handle a weaker country, if you want to call it that, than the way we are currently doing it.
I agree. Honestly, I would add to that. Uh, Whatever they're doing, and for whatever reason, I think we need to listen to them just to figure out how much of the bullshit, pardon me saying that, how much of the misinformation and how much of, the fake news and all the other made up things is kind of like, or can be, to reasonable, with some reasonable logical thinking, deduced to be kind of like accurate. So the Russians, they don't kind of like, having American missiles in Poland and in Romania, and they don't like to have NATO members on their borders, which I think are perfectly reasonable, propositions. Now, they will not get everything they want, and this goes back to what you said. Like, is there an off ramp? So far, I think I'm in agreement with the last person in charge of the German Democratic Republic, who just has published his memoirs, Egon Krenz, uh, who was, by the way, interviewed in the same media outlet, or by the same media outlet that wrote this god awful piece about the COVID protests in Austria. Because it's like, why don't the Europeans go to Washington and try to talk some sense to the Americans? Because what we are seeing, if you're looking at energy prices, if you're looking at the fact that now the US is the biggest single exporter of liquefied natural gas, it's like, who is actually the enemy? This is a question that everybody who's like waving the flag, wears the lapel pins, like stand with Ukraine and everything else, is kind of like omitting.
Yeah.
If we're looking at how this looks like right now in Europe, now, 3 weeks ago, the Norwegian government is like, yeah, there may be some rationing of electricity just before the snow melt in spring. Now, this week, they are talking about autumn and rationing and everything else, which is like,
Yeah, these are war measures on a domestic population that did not choose the war, and does not want it. I mean, most of the polls show throughout Europe, people would rather prefer peace with Russia. Now, I'm sure there's a way to do it. I'm not sure, if there's a way to knock sense into Putin either, because hopefully that side also figures out that what they're doing is not, it's not helping anyone. I think it's harming them as well. I mean, it's obviously harming the sanctions and stuff, but it's destroying their own gas infrastructure as well. Because if you stop the flow, you destroy all your infrastructure. So there's only damage all the way around.
Yeah,
Um,
and I mean, I'm not sure I agree with the notion that the sanctions are working against Russia. I would tentatively propose they are
yeah.
working. Maybe they were intended, I don't know, but the Western sanctions are hurting the European economies
Oh,
most.
definitely. They
So I'm not sure this was the intention of the people in Washington who came up with this wonderful idea, which I think was very stupid and as could have been anticipated. I mean, the shenanigans with the certification of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, whatever you want to think about it personally, about the business deals and transactions between, say, Germany and Russia and the implications. But in the end, I mean, Europeans are going to pay very high prices for energy, for transportation. We may get rationing of fuel and food. Uh, so if this is like kind of like, I don't know if this was the intent all along, but this is surely what it looks like. It's going to be the consequence.
Yeah.
And if this was kind of like accidental or incidental, I don't know. I mean, the Russians are laying pipelines to India and to Southeast Asia as fast as they can, because they are, as you mentioned, I think correctly, are in a pickle as well in terms of like they have this infrastructure in place. It has been there for decades to sell gas to the West. And now the West says we don't want to buy it anymore. And we're not even talking about, I mean, you brought the engineering. I mean, the stupidity, it's breathtaking. Our European refineries are fine-tuned to use Russian fossil energy and, in refineries, crack it, distill it, etc., and turn it into useful things that we all need. Now, you can't just, say, I don't want to buy from Putin anymore, so let's buy from, the Emir of Qatar, who until yesterday I also didn't like for his treatment of, migrant workers, women, you name
Oh,
it.
and we had no moral objection to buying oil from Saudi Arabia when they were bombing the Yemenis,
They are
so
still doing that, and yes, there are no moral qualms there. So it's like I don't even understand it. Why we are making, taking
well,
this as the hill to die on.
there's a few reasons why. One thing, it is true, Ukraine is close to Europe. We don't want to admit it, but there is a cultural aspect to it. The other one is there's a lot of countries in Eastern Europe, I think, that throughout historical reasons are fearful of the Russian bear. And they are pushing the European politics the other way. Now, what worries me in particular about this Ukraine situation is that it is um, allowing other forms of nationalisms to assert itself again. Like, for example, in Hungary. Don't know if you know, last year, Viktor Orban made a speech commemorating the Treaty of Trianon, which broke up Hungary. I'm sure you're more aware of it than I am. And there's a part of Ukraine that's Hungarian. Okay, and Orban is looking at this thing and he says, well, maybe if Ukraine gets a little bit weaker, maybe there's something in it for me. We're seeing something similar with Poland.
Yes,
Um,
it's true.
you know,
Or one
so
of the places that's usually overlooked, Moldova and Romania.
yeah, and
Same thing.
same phonemic. So you're going to embolden them. Now let's assume the war comes to an end. If they start making territorial demands in that area, I mean, you can easily find ourselves in a World War One situation.
Yeah.
It's not inconceivable. So you'd want to end this thing for more than just energy prices. Guys, there's a million reasons I can give you to end this war ASAP. But the response from Washington and Europe is more weapons is going to solve the problem. I just find it lunacy that is going on at the moment, and yet that is the current policy.
This bring. I mean, you just mentioned this. This is hilariously funny in a very awkward way. And funny
Mm.
is certainly the wrong term to use here. But just think about mass shootings in the U.S., for instance, for just one moment, to bring up this one other cultural marker of absurdity here, and to drive home why this is patently absurd in the context of mass shootings and gun control debates
Mm.
in the US. We are constantly told that the weapons, they just, I mean, you can have as many assault rifles as you wish to have, because it's always the people who pull the trigger, right? This is basically the condensed argument. And in the Ukrainian context, we don't even know where the weapons will end up. And you
Yeah.
can pour, I don't know how many tons or tens of hundreds and thousands of tons of equipment into Ukraine. And I would bet literally the farm on the fact that many of those weapons will never reach the front lines. A sizable part of them will end up on the black market, fueling whatever god awful
Those
thing to
javelins
come.
or those javelins already trading on the dark web for, and that's easy. It's easy to envision a European politician driving in a convoy and a javelin hits his car in the future.
Yeah,
By some
that's
kind of
very,
terrorist.
very clear possibility. And the other thing I would mention is like, so if it's not guns that's actually doing the killing, but the people, do we have a debate about whether or not all the refugees that have come to the western part, and this is also part of like the omissions that you don't really hear about, but it's all there. Go to the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner and to the refugees organizations. They will give you like millions of people who went to Russia, but they are non-people in a way. It's like they don't matter. What matters is the people who come to the West, and there is some kind of like absurd racism involved as well. In terms of like, they look a little bit more like us, quote unquote, Western white looking Europeans.
Right.
Hence, we should care a little bit more about them as opposed to all the refugees in sub Saharan Africa, for instance. So there is a lot of racism in there as well. I think it's also driven by a lot of like fear. Will the Russians, just continue marching west and somehow they end up, 3 weeks later, they stand, as you said, at the Straits of Gibraltar, which I think is like a wrong reading in terms of like, why would they? Russia is the largest country by territory. There is, yes, apart from the oligarchs who kind of like fell out of favor with Putin, who have like first homes in London and second homes at the French Riviera, it's like there is no sizable Russian population in Western Europe that the Russians could kind of like, argue or make an argument of wanting to protect there.
Well, I mean, even if there was one, I mean, maybe Estonia, but okay, not Central Europe, it's the Baltics, but NATO is still there. NATO is armed to the teeth still, and they'd be even more foolish if they try that. But I just, maybe I'm foolish, but I don't buy the argument that Russia would want to expand it further, because it's already costing them just to get on the economics of it. Just if you look at the lives lost for Russians, it's costing a hell of a lot. They're also damaging their own economy. War mobilizes a population. Whether the gas sanctions are working is another question. And then the other one is just the obvious. The Ukrainians are dying for this. So,
Yeah.
if you want to end the conflict, that is the question here. That's what you tell your leaders. Just find a diplomatic solution that does not involve sending more weapons to kill people. And it is a possibility. There is a way to do so.
I think so, but the problem is I would argue that much like, I mean, I don't subscribe to Mr. Krentz's ideological predisposition because he's still an ardent defender of Soviet-style communism. But I think that he has a point when he says, why don't the Europeans go to DC and try to talk some sense into the Americans?
Right.
Which I think shows you what amount of sovereignty European countries have left, which is basically not that much. Part of it has to do with, let's say, historical reasons, World War II, etc. And part of it has to do with the structures the Americans have built in Europe, most notably NATO. But let's not forget the European Union in that context. It's not directly American built and imposed, but the European Union, which, by the way, came into existence in the same year that the Soviet Union disappeared, which I think is a historically amusing coincidence, but the European Union is 30 years old. But if you look at it, it's a kind of like quasi-federal superstructure that, in a way, functions by imposing regulatory and judicial fiat on its member states. It's,
Yeah.
I think, thoroughly anti-democratic when And for that argument to I think stand a chance for a debate, we would have to say, what do we mean by this? We by that mean, of course,
But
control
I
by
mean,
the people.
just look at the European Parliament to see the type of rhetoric that's currently coming out there. There's no, I mean, the only dissenting voice is Ireland at this stage. It's the only voice that is saying, look, there should be another way than the current approach. So there's like among the leaders, among the elites, there's like a unanimous agreement with the current policy, even though it is evidently causing harm to their own electorates. And as you say, that this might be American dominance, the extraterritorialization of the Monroe Doctrine is definitely something of that. But I think a great part of it is also ideology. There
Yeah.
is still I mean, anti-communism was translated to many Europeans as anti-Russian. And I think that is playing a major part in this whole thing.
I would agree, and I would simply add to that. It's like it's an unwillingness. I would think is the unwillingness of a sizable part of the population to actually exercise not just the rights that our constitutions confer upon us, but also to, you know, uh, reclaim in a civically responsible way the duties of citizenship, because citizenship is not being a consumer and expecting to have this right to this or that gimmick. It means to be informed, and it means to try to affect people's lives. And if you now think like, look, our societies are so hilariously complex and convoluted, it's so hard as an individual to kind of like have an impact. I'm not going to dispute you. I would simply point to the fact that if that statement, which is true, keeps you from getting off the couch and doing something, at least trying to do something, then it's like people have given up. And then the question becomes a systemic one, I would argue. If our system of governance and the way we organize our societies, are they up to kind of like, generating legitimacy, by which I think could arguably be defined as providing food, shelter, prosperity, and opportunity for at least a sizable, if not the vast majority of the population. If you look at the last half year, this is decidedly not what our politicians are doing,
No,
which calls
and
into question how they treat the potential fallout, and we can see it. I mean,
but
just
I think this comes to the broader topic of what your article covered is that the response to the grievances of the general population. I mean, going the Gilets jaunes is a good example, another good example of this. Is not to speak to the concerns of them and find ways to mitigate the damage or do it. It is the response is propaganda essentially.
it's not just propaganda. This is the way they convey it, but it's like to preemptively label any dissent as extremist, as far right wing. I mean, in the American context, we could now talk about Trump derangement syndrome, which I think is a very good, descriptor. But just last Saturday, both Austrian state media as well as the German ones. Incidentally, part of the Austrian coverage was written by the same people whose articles I analyzed. They warned, they said like discontent. I mean, the notion has been there. The Economist has published extensively on it in recent weeks, but they are warning that people with legitimate grievances, be they socially motivated, be they economic, such as like energy prices, food prices, rents, fuel prices, all are going up. But both Austrian and German state media has preemptively declared them to be borderline illegitimate because they are right-wing extremists. And the really perfidious thing about it is not that this chips away at our constitutionally guaranteed and enshrined rights to the freedom of expression and assembly, which I think are natural rights and not something that just, came into being because some smartass just wrote it down on a piece of paper. These are natural rights. But the problem there is, of course, this is why it's so dangerous to further double and quadruple down on this rhetoric that we have discussed earlier with respect to the COVID mandates and to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But to now declare with the same line of quote-unquote reasoning that the people who are protesting at home, these are like our family, this is our
Yeah.
friends, this is our fellow citizens, that they are somehow these crazy tinfoil hat wearing lunatics who must not be listened to and even less permitted to even have a voice. This is tantamount to declaring them preemptively, you go out and protest, you are a citizen, second class citizen. What we are doing with this, and this is state media, and this is extremely concerning, I would argue, is they are preemptively declaring open season on dissenters. And on a practical level, that means that far right wing extremism, whatever it may actually mean and be, which is something we haven't talked about
Right.
for the last 90 or so minutes, but will become a much more powerful because force in domestic politics again, because if you declare the bottom rungs of the economic income distribution to be far-right extremists because they go out because they can't heat their homes, because they can't have 3 meals a day and feed their children, and you declare them far-right wingers, we are basically, going back to a very weird version
Well,
of the late
I think
1920s and
we're going
early
to come to a
1930s.
point where we will no longer know how to identify a real Nazi. Um, you know, because
That
it's
on
it's
top of it, but if we would then see a situation where, I mean, if you look at it historically speaking, you can see those alternative right-wing formations, such as in Austria's context, the Freedom Party, the various iterations. I always forget the most recent name of the Le Pen faction in France, but or the Alternative for Germany
yeah.
in Germany, where you can see that these are systemic opposition parties. But we would then come to a point where it's conceivable to have a party that takes parliament, in strides, because literally, if you declare 2/3 of the population kind of like Nazis, they will probably at some point go with like, yeah, sure, if they call me one, well, maybe I am one, so who cares?
Well, we saw signs. I'm not sure if it's that bad yet in France, but in this election, Macron lost. He lost the absolute majority in the
Yeah.
parliament, right? So he has to have coalition, and the vaccine mandates were defeated in unity between Marine Le Pen's faction and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the dedicated Trotskyite and the far right person. Okay, so the communists and the fascists are standing together for the first time ever. They defeated the vaccine mandates, which I think was a legitimate thing, but it doesn't mean you endorse the broader spectrum of their politics, and that is where we are heading. And I think it's across the European continent, you're seeing that these legitimate grievances are only being talked about by people on the extreme edge. I mean, you saw it in Australia as well. This One Nation, it's always been a fringe movement there. They spoke a little bit against the Dutch farmers, for example, who were protesting against the climate policies that have gone haywire in the Netherlands. That's the only party that speaks about it. The Australian Parliament, by what's it, Pauline Hanson's party, who once won Australia. It just sounds nuts, the name of the party. But those are the only ones making those voices. And you're seeing it with the environmental debate, you're seeing it with the extremist debate, the vaccine debate, the same tactics, different victims.
Yeah, and I would argue to kind of like drive this point that you just made home. I would argue what you're seeing is also a kind of like, let's say, yes, the polarization is there, but we are crowding out by by way of like media personalities and a lot of people just accepting this kind of like really, really bad. I'm not even sure if I want to call it journalism at this point. Uh, would be like what we're doing is like we're crowding out reasonable debates. We're crowding out rhetoric, so to speak, because we are always saying, okay, if it's not this one, we can't have a debate about this or that. And we are not even talking about whether or not this is a good thing that is covered, such as the Dutch farmers' protest, for instance. We are not even talking about it, and we are even less talking about the root origins, which is, and this is something I mentioned, however, briefly a couple of moments ago, by judicial or regulatory fiat. Historically speaking, I'm amazed by the fact that the thing that people are not taught in school is something that is as simple as the differentiation between primary and secondary legislation. And if you haven't heard about it, that speaks to my argument here. But what it really is pretty simple. A law is primary legislation because a law, the way it is, I'm sorry, the way it comes about in a Republican state, for instance, is the legislature. There is somebody who proposes it. Could be a member of parliament. Could be the government, and then it goes through procedural rules and goes all you have to check all the boxes. There need to be debate 1, debate 2, debate 3. There's need to be amendments possible. There's votes in committees and subcommittees, etc. And once it is promulgated, that is, once Parliament passed it, it's the law of the land. This is primary legislation. Secondary legislation is derivative of it, by which is meant, and this is really easy to understand, everything that's required to implement said law, which is, say, regulations, ordinances, or if Russia does it, it's called decrees. It's not, an executive order. It's a decree because it sounds a little bit more autocratic, I guess. I don't know if there is like a handbook of journalism writing or something like this, but it's like it's ordinances, it's regulation. So it's like we have the law that says A, but in order to have you to do A, in the Dutch case, the government says, look, the European Court has ordered us to do something. But the judicial branch, they are, checking whether or not everything is legal and going according to the books. They can't, yes, they can order you to adhere to the law and everything else and to the regulations, but they don't write them. But just imagine the insanity. We're not talking about the fact that a nation-state government, the Dutch one, is claiming, because of the European Court's decision, that they now need to pass an ordinance. It's not a law. They say we need to follow the regulations coming out of EU Brussels. If this is not, raising the citizens' alarm bells, and in the Dutch case it does, not for this reason though, I don't know what could trigger any citizen into action.
Well, I think ultimately what triggers the general populace is inflation when it hits them in their pockets. And I think we're seeing signs of that already, that this bus is going to come. If it continues, they can only squeeze people so far. I've just been amazed at how far the public is willing to be squeezed. But I think there is going to be a moment where people either push back, snap against it. But to the broader point of this, I think what has happened is we have entered a time of feudalism. Where you have a certain caste, if you will, that is trying to enforce the ideology onto a populace that doesn't want it, and they're trying to use whatever means or method it is to do so. So whether it's a decree, whether it's a law, whether it's a propaganda technique, it doesn't matter. They have a certain vision which ties in with the climate vision normally. It ties in with the anti-Russian vision, and anything that dissents from that narrative is punished and swept apart.
Now that you brought the F word up again, and since this is actually my area of professional expertise, I'm going to say something, because the notion of neo-feudalism, often it's used with the prefix neo as in new, is something that's really widespread among not only heterodox economists such as Michael Hudson, for instance, or Steve Keen, but it's also something that you hear very frequently from commentators on the political left of center. But what I would argue makes a qualitative difference is And I'm not saying this to make the case for, the landlords of early modern or medieval Europe were such benign people and we should kind of like, give them back the lands. I don't subscribe to that point. But if you run out of money or food or have problems in, say, 300 years ago, you would go and petition the landlord and ask for redress of grievance. And the landlord would then usually, kind of like, give you a tax break, albeit only temporarily, would, tell people to, kind of like help you, or would even give you some money or some food stuff, citing his Christian conscience in that case. Can you imagine writing to the tax authority, this faceless institution, saying, look, I'm falling on hard times here. Could you please kind of like reduce my taxes? I mean, they do that automatically because it's tied to your income, but could you kind of like, give me some money or something, appealing to the conscience of a politician? I mean, this is like a ludicrous
Well,
proposition.
these days it's going to be a robot, the algorithm. So
or something, but that's even worse, because I mean, if you write a code that, kind of like comes up or adds a little bit of empathy or a mimicry of empathy to a robot, it's of course fake, because it's like it's not a human.
yeah,
I mean, that would work, but always keep in mind, feudalism implied both a number of things, like social inequality. It implied, I'm not going to go for economic stasis or non-progress, low productivity, low economic growth, if there ever was some. Under feudalism, that was certainly not self-sustained, steady growth, but it also had its kind of like benefits in terms of like it was a mutually inclusive arrangement. So it's like it ties the landlord and the subject together. I'm not saying were equal in power, but if you contrast this with the situation we are faced right now, is like our societies are atomized to a degree that we come up with wonderful new terminology to kind of like relate to ever smaller instances of belonging or self-identification, such as, say, intersectionality. Uh, but there is nothing that ties together the ruled and the rulers anymore, other than, time-honored institutions such as
yeah,
parliaments, where we're.
it's more of a technocratic feudalism of sorts, that we're in.
I'd call it fake feudalism, because, as I said, it's like it's or a farcical version thereof. I mean, I could cite Marx in the 18th Brumaire, when he, in terms of like, history repeats itself, first as a tragedy, the second time as a farce. If the first one, the real deal of feudalism, pre-industrial European civilization, was the real thing, it was in many ways a tragedy. How do you think, if you follow down that line of argumentation, which of course is also kind of like, propagandistic, argument to make,
prophetic, yeah.
it's like, it's going to be a farce, because if you think about it, I mean, you don't even have to go to like this strange World Economic Forum, like, wet dreams of like owning nothing and being happy or something, or something like this, to realize that this is a farcical proposition, because feudalism also implies that those few in the privileged class and social status group would own literally everything, and everybody else would toil for them and would be at their mercy. And this is not something that, in our conditions, postmodernism, post-capital, whatever capitalism, whatever you want to call it, but under our conditions, I would argue we are lacking a kind of like basic morality. Now, I'm not saying, Christian ethics as they were actually existing in pre-industrial Europe, kind of like were the best of the best, but they were there. And they guided both the rulers and the ruled. But if you look at the logic of our societies and how capital accumulation works, you cannot fail to notice that certain people, like the mega billionaires, they have very different ethics, and they hold themselves to very different standards than you do or I do.
especially what they preach to others with regards to the environment. That's all.
I mean, it's not as if, like it's like the gospel says, Jesus said, like the poor will always be with us. There will always be rich and poor people. But this is why it says it's a farcical, or a kind of like very weird kind of technocratic feudalism. I like the term, by the way, but it's like we have two different levels of, let's say, basic values, ways of looking at the world right now. Whereas in the real kind of real feudalism, in scare quotes, you would have the same kind of like, framework of reference with respect to both morality and ethics, and intimations about how you would lead a good life, that tied both the landlord and the subject
And you argue
together.
that that is not there at the moment. That is the
I don't
difference.
think so. I think that this is one of the consequences of modernity, and propaganda is ultimately, if we're talking about modernity with a capital M, you would basically think about it as something that gradually emerges over the course of the later 18th and 19th centuries, and it creates the national state as we know it, the European national state. And that means, in Benedict Anderson's memorable phrase, it's an imagined community. So you got to make up stuff to kind of like unite all the people of the various parts of the community that should be in the national state. And that would be something where you would need to teach people to behave in a certain way, to identify in a certain way. And this is done by preaching, in a way. Like I like the way you said it. It's like the preaching part, but it's done by premeditated, organization in especially the schools, in the workplace. I mean, Foucault would also add like the prisons to add to this listing, but it's like you don't want to have a debate. I mean, look at, say, like, autobiographies of very famous people from the 19th century, and check out what they write about their school years. Horrible abuses. And why? Because schools and education in particular, and this might strike you as somewhat ironic coming from a university professor with tenure, but schools and universities and the education system, they proselytize, we propagandize. We want to train people to do certain
It's a
things.
system of indoctrination, primarily.
It is. It is also a system where you can actually learn something, but that is something where we would have to differentiate between, the things that are practical. Like in engineering, it's a little bit more hands-on than in, say, history or in philosophy. But the way it selects and the way academic merits kind of like, are awarded, it's more like for conformity rather than for, innovation at this point.
Well, I don't think it's unique to the universities. You find it in corporate institutions as well. It doesn't select for merit, let me put it that way. It does somewhat. There's not no merit to it, but sometimes it's also for ideological conformity. Anyways,
Yes.
on that topic, I think I've gone way over time. So I'd like to thank you for the conversation. And I encourage people, first of all, please subscribe. And secondly, to please read your article on the right-wing propaganda and how it's being abused in Europe. So that's like the message coming forward. I think many people know it, but you cited two very good examples, and it's a good comparison. So yeah, thank you for coming.
Thank you again for having me. I greatly enjoyed this. I didn't even check that we are so overdue. So I hope to see you again before too long. Thanks again.